towards some of my more recent work on an enhanced model of investment that I've done with my former student, Von Darwin. And then from there, to continue to look at how we can draw on technology to democratize flows of information in different parts of the world, and how important it is to draw on technology to share resources internationally. So if we look at my work on identity and language learning, the question that I've always been interested in is how we connect the language learner and the social world. How do we theorize the complex relationship between the two?
Yeah, I'm okay.
I hope, Oscar, I hope you can hear me.
Yep, everything is okay. Please keep
Okay,
going.
I heard a sound coming in. Thank you. I've asked, under what conditions does social interaction take place? And very interestingly, we are sitting here in a fascinating virtual world where I'm sitting in Vancouver. Some of you are in Sweden. People are in perhaps other parts of the world. We have Oscar in the background, and we have a digital environment that enables us to connect across time and space. But for me, the question also is, to what extent do social relations of power, such as racism, sexism, elitism, homophobia, limit opportunities for language learners to speak? And so we're looking in many ways at an unequal world, whether that world is the world in classrooms or across national borders. If we go to some of my very early work with immigrant women in Canada, just look at what Martina had to say. She said, "I feel uncomfortable using English in the group of people whose English language is their mother tongue, because they speak fluently without any problems, and I feel inferior." So here we have a woman, a very talented woman, a professional architect, who nevertheless feels inferior because she cannot speak the English language. She's from the original Czechoslovakia. And this is why I argued that every time language learners speak, they are not only exchanging information with their interlocutors, they are organizing and reorganizing a sense of who they are and how they relate to the social world. They are, in other words, engaged in identity construction and negotiation. If we look at a little bit more, some more recent data, what we see here is that my work assumes that language is not only a linguistic system, but also a social practice. And I'm just drawing this little bit of data from that was shared with us, Margaret Early and I, by Doris Abiria, who spent a year in Vancouver with her 2 children. And she came from Uganda. And when she went back to Uganda, we were interested in the experience of the children when they returned to their classrooms in Uganda. And they were young boys, about 6, 7, 8 years old. And she wrote and said, "The boys are getting better. In school, the teachers complain they have gone with the style they are calling Western. The teachers say the boys have an accent that they do not hear, while the boys say the teachers speak English upside down. Paul talks to the teacher in class anytime he wishes, when children are expected first to listen to the teacher and talk when the teacher asks them. Now we keep checking on them frequently in school and supporting them more at home. We hope that by next year they will be okay." So what we see here is that when Paul was a student in the Canadian context, there were certain practices that defined him as a good student. Talking, chatting, contributing very actively in the class. When he goes back to Uganda, there are different sets of practices that define him as a good student. He also has to learn to navigate new accents. So what does it mean to speak English in Canada? What does it mean to speak English in Uganda? So what we see that what defined a good student in the Canadian context is not the same as what defines a good student in the Ugandan context, which shows in a sense how complex it is to be a language learner across different times and different places. And I see this as an issue of identity. How does Paul understand his relationship to the world? How is that relationship structured across time and space? And how does Paul and his family understand possibilities for the future? This also connects with issues of motivation and investment, which are ideas that I have worked with for many years. The construct of investment is a complementary construct to motivation, because motivation is a psychological construct. It frequently is seen as the characteristic of an individual who are either motivated or unmotivated. It often assumes a unitary and coherent individual. Whereas when I talk about investment, this is a sociological construct. It assumes that learners are social beings, that they have complex identities, changing across time and space, and reproduced in social interaction. Issues of power are also central to issues of investment. So if we think back on Paul, Paul could be a highly motivated student, but he could be seen as a troublemaker in the Ugandan context, but in fact a highly motivated student in the Canadian context. And a lot has to do then with his investment. This has an impact on his investment in the language practices of the classroom. I define investment by arguing that if learners invest in a second language, they will acquire a wider range of symbolic and material resources, which will increase their cultural capital and social power. And by symbolic resources, I refer to language, education, friendship, and material resources, issues of capital, real estate, and money. So for me, the interesting question is, how do we reframe questions? It's useful to ask, are students motivated to learn a language? Are teachers motivated to teach a language? These are fair questions and important questions. But it's also important to ask the question, are students and teachers invested in the language and literacy practices of a given classroom and community? And issues of identity are central. Even though students, of course, we can understand issues of motivation and investment with regard to students, the issues of teachers are also important as well, because teachers often find themselves in sites of struggle in certain classrooms and communities. Just look at Keely Ryan, for example. I've written about this in an article that appeared in Gary Barkhuizen's book in 2017. She was a teacher of adult learners here in Vancouver and was a student in one of my classes. And she was struggling with a high dropout rate from her adult learners. She said before she was introduced to the construct of investment, she had a class in which there were 25 students at the beginning of the class, and 9 students remained by the end of the semester. After she grappled with the construct of investment and learned about issues of identity, She said in the next class, there were 29 students in her class and 25 remained at the end of the class. So I asked her, what did you do? What was different in your practices? And she said, I began by imagining what a good English teacher would look like for my students. I altered my practice to reflect what I imagined their idea of a good school would look like. So in other words, she wanted to foster investment on the part of her students. So she had to position herself as a good teacher in their eyes. And she did this through a number of practices to determine what would be a good teacher in the eyes of her students, which for her own purposes also meant that she felt more invested in the classroom practices. So we're dealing now in 2015, and we have a new economic world order. We have evolving theories on language ideologies, linguistic capital, and symbolic competence. We have the amazing work of Jan Blommaert and Pierre Bourdieu, Claire Pramsch, and others who are struggling to better understand the complex world in which we live. It's a world defined, of course, by changing technology and also a highly mobile world where people are crossing borders. And we do that, of course, not only in person as people move from place to place, but also through the virtual world in which we all move as we are doing right now in this webinar. I've worked with Ron Darwin, my former student who's now at Chinese University of Hong Kong. And we've developed an expanded model of investment. We called it a model of investment, which was published in the annual review of applied linguistics in 2015. What we saw were challenges for the 21st century, where we have a new social world, new forms of social interaction, such as the one that is taking place right now, and new ways of conceptualizing speech. So the question becomes, how does one claim the right to speak in the digital era? The fascinating thing, of course, is that to claim the right to speak, to claim the right to an education is very unequal across the world. If we look at UNESCO's 2019 data, at least 750 million youth and adults still cannot read and write, and 250 million children are failing to acquire basic literacy skills. This is a very uneven world, because what we see here from the Education for All Global Monitoring Report of 2013-2014, we see that 96% of children in North America and Western Europe stay in school till grade 4 and achieve minimum standards. Only 40% of children in sub-Saharan Africa stay in school till grade 4 and achieve minimum standards. So we see, a highly unequal world. And if we're thinking about claiming legitimacy and equality in a digital world, we see that in some parts of the world, people have already dropped out of school before they've ever had the chance to touch a computer. What is so interesting, of course, is that people are still highly invested in the digital world. And I acknowledge this photo from Willie Ngaka, which was taken in northwestern Uganda. Even if people live in a context in which there is no electricity and running water, they will take the clay from the land and build a keyboard so that one day when they do have electricity and running water and computers, they can very quickly move into the digital world. So when you think about issues of imagined identities and imagined communities, you can see what a powerful image this captures. Let's look at Henrietta's shifting identity, for example. In the one image, you see that the classic image of many young women in the Ugandan context is a domestic one. You'll see they carry water, their little yellow bottle, do a great deal of domestic work every day. But if you put a camera in that young woman's hand, you shift her identity. She becomes, for many people, someone of greater value in her community. She can go into a police commissioner's office, as you see in the bottom, one of the bottom pictures. She can take a picture of a police commissioner. Normally, she would never, ever even go anywhere near a police commissioner's office. But when she has a camera in her hand, she has the resources and the cultural capital that gives her the right to speak and to engage more broadly in her community. You'll see in the final picture, which was taken in an internet cafe in southwestern Uganda, the young woman went into that internet cafe that they had never been in before and said, "Today is our day. The world belongs to us." This is true, of course, also for teachers. This is what Betty had to say. "I feel very powerful like a man because I've never held a camera in my life. I've always seen only men carrying cameras and taking photos in big public functions, like maybe independence celebration, political rallies, and wedding ceremonies. But now, as I move in the community, taking pictures with my camera, I feel I am also very powerful, like a man. I am now a learned person." I find this very bittersweet because Betty was, of course, a learned person a long time before she picked up a camera. But the way that the digital reframes her in her community gives her a power that she had not had prior to that point. So Ron and I developed an expanded model of investment. We tried to address how people claim the right to speak, given the way power operates materially and symbolically in the digital era. That model of investment not only connects, of course, with issues of identity, identity that we see as a site of struggle, changing, complex across time and space, but also issues of capital, as defined particularly by Bourdieu, and also issues of ideology, which is more well developed in this model. By capital, we refer not only to economic capital, which is what many people associate with capital, wealth, property, and income, but crucially, cultural capital, what knowledge you have, your educational credentials, your knowledge of certain cultural forms, and social capital, the connections to networks of power that give you opportunity in life. And in terms of ideology, the dominant ways of thinking that organize and stabilize societies while simultaneously determining modes of inclusion and exclusion. So the question becomes, to what extent are language learners invested in the language and literacy practices of a given classroom or community within the context of this very unequal digital world. It's because I come from the African context, I was born in South Africa, that I've become involved in working with digital storytelling that crosses borders, and worked with an organization called SADI in South Africa. And they actually developed the African Storybook, also online, to try to reach out to children across many different countries in the African context. They have over 1,000 unique stories with over 5,000 translations in more than 180 African languages, as well as English, French, and Portuguese. I've worked with students in the Canadian context who come from many different countries in Africa, on the African continent, one of whom was Juliet Tembe in the top right-hand corner, who worked with me for a number of years, Sam Andema in the bottom corner, who's now back in Uganda, Espen Stranger Johansen, who helped to develop Storybooks Norway and has worked with me on the development of global storybooks. And in the top corner is, I've worked with Tessa Welch from SADI. So we've worked as a team to democratize knowledge flows through open access technology. So we moved from the African Storybook, because you can work from the African Storybook, into Storybooks Canada. So that was our first development of a digital site for not only the African context, but also the Canadian context. And Liam Doherty, who worked with us on the development of the African Storybooks site for global use, was integral to that project. So we now have got sites in many different parts of the world where people are drawing on the African Storybook and drawing on these open access stories to reach a very wide community. What have we done with the African Storybook that is value added, so to speak? What we did is we drew 40 illustrated stories from the African Storybook, which have levels 1 to 5. We targeted the needs of a particular country. We now, in fact, have over 40 countries across 5 continents. We customized the sites for the languages of those particular countries. We enable people to toggle between parallel texts and translanguage in downloaded texts. And crucially, we developed an audio component for each of the stories, which helps listeners to make connection between sound and symbol. And these stories can all be used on mobile devices and cell phones. And this is also very important in the African context, where even if people don't have computers, many people now have access to cell phones. So this is just a screenshot of what Storybooks Canada looks like, and I'm going to take you to that site as we move into the second part of this presentation. We also are very interested in Indigenous storybooks as well in the Canadian and international context. And we have developed a site that draws on new set of stories that are particularly relevant to the Indigenous context. And that is also available on our sites. And I'm very excited to share with you Storybooks Sweden. And I hope that's why when I received this invitation to present to you today, I was very excited to share with you Storybooks Sweden. You'll notice that my voice is a little hoarse because like many people in winter, I've been struggling a little with the cold. The people who've worked with us on the Storybook Sweden site are Monica Bravo Granstrom and Lena Norman Younger. And you might wonder, where do they come from? These are two people who are part of an organization called Swedish as Mother Tongue Abroad. And Monica is the one standing next to me. And Lena met me and my student Asma Afrin at a conference here in Vancouver. And when they learned about our Global Storybooks project and our Storybooks Canada project, they said, we've got to do something for Sweden. And this is what I hope to share with you today. All of this is made possible through Creative Commons, because when people are active in projects like this, they do get recognition for their work. Because once you make your work open access, people can use it in many different ways, as long as you acknowledge where it comes from. And Kelsey Wien, for example, said, the magic of Storybooks Canada, finding and building, translating and remixing the African Storybook Project, is the magic we hoped for, but didn't know we could dream of. This is the power of open. So I do acknowledge the power of open technology and open source. Since we're also, of course, in a university context, there are many questions that this kind of project generates for research. To what extent do the parallel texts in global storybooks promote language learning? How helpful is the toggle feature? Is translanguaging productive for language learning? To what extent can this support language awareness? What do we mean by multilingual identity? How well do stories travel from one region of the world to another? What are diverse students, readers' investments? How can school teachers use global storybooks to promote multilingual literacy in classes where many languages are spoken, which I'm sure is the case in Sweden as it is in many different parts of the world? To what extent can global storybooks promote school connections for immigrant and refugee students? And what challenges do translators have? For example, I've worked with Espen Stranger Johansson in publishing an article in the Modern Language Journal in 2017, looking at the investments of teachers in the African storybook. And what is the connection to teacher identity? We looked, for example, as teachers as change agents, and we looked at one of the stories called Andiswe Stock a Star. And as one of the teachers says, it really helped me. It changed the attitudes of boys, where they could think that a girl is not supposed to play football. But this time when I go for my physical education lesson, when I prepare a lesson about football, they don't now complain. They don't kick the ball away from the girls. They just play together like that. This time they have started attitude change instead. It helped me a lot. So what we see is some very exciting developments and changes within the school and classroom context. So the journey continues, and I want to take you out of my PowerPoints and take you actually into a site and demonstrate the site to you. So here I am, just to show you everybody, the Global Storybooks portal. And you can see now, we're calling it Global Storybooks. Is a free multilingual literacy resource for children and youth worldwide. You can simply Google it at home if you've got your cell phones with you, globalstorybooks.net. You can read, download, toggle, and listen to a wide variety of illustrated stories from the African Storybook and other open sites. I'll just scroll down and you can see all the different sites. The Storybooks Canada site is the most well-developed site that we have. So you can always go back to the Storybooks Canada site to see what developments have taken place there. But I'll just take you through all the different sites that we have. Greece, Guinea, Haiti, Hong Kong is our indigenous site, Jamaica, Kenya, Korea, Liberia, Mali, Mauritius, Mexico, Minnesota, Poland, Rwanda. There we have Sweden. So I'm going to take you to the Swedish site, and you can actually, you can see some of the features of the site. You'll see that when we worked with Monica and Lena, they not only, what they did was they translated the 40 stories that we have on our global storybook site. There are 50 stories, just taking you down. Here, by the way, is on Diswe Stocker Star, which is a level 2 story that I was talking about. And there we just have a number of those. You see, they're all beautifully illustrated stories. So they translated these stories into Swedish, and they also translated the interface as well, so that people can have access to the site. I'm going to show you here one of the stories. You'll see, just to share with you, all these stories are available in a variety of languages that are spoken in Sweden. Not all of these have all the stories translated into these languages, but there will be a sample at least. And you'll see as well that Sami is one of the languages that we have included on the site, Northern Sami, but we've only got one story in that language. So if anybody wants to volunteer or has somebody they know who could do translations, we could certainly share our translation app with you. You'll see here, you can also change the level of the story. But I'm going to take you to the story, this particular story, which is What Are You Doing? And I'm taking you to that story because this is the one story that is available in both Swedish and Sami. But I'm going to just take you through. You'll see by looking at the story here, you'll find out through Creative Commons who wrote the story, who illustrated the story, who translated the story. You'll see that it's in Swedish. You'll see that this is the level. We don't yet have this in audio format. We hope in due course that will be the case. But you can toggle down and you'll see here that you have the story in Swedish. I'll just take you down. You can take this down word by word, as frame by frame. But you'll also see we have it in Sami as well. So you can, Marie translated this for us. Now, if you don't speak Sami, you can toggle between Sami and Swedish. So there we have Swedish. And there we have Sami. So the toggle feature, you can see, is a very powerful feature. And in Sweden, I understand that there may be, for example, Arabic speakers. So I'm going to take you to Arabic because there may be, you may have in Sweden, Arabic, perhaps people from Syria, as we have here in Canada and other parts of the Arabic world. Now, if you look over here, you'll see that we do have an audio for Arabic. So I'm going to share that audio with you. And let's see, hope you can hear that, everybody.
أنا أغني.
Okay, I'll take you to the next one.
هي تؤشر.
Okay, take you to the next one.
أنا أصفق.
Okay, now you may not speak Arabic, or your learners may would be interested perhaps in what does this mean in Swedish, or how do you say this in Swedish, and so you can actually move between Swedish and Arabic. And for those, of course, who are learning English, perhaps, or perhaps are more familiar with English, we have English as another example. And here we'll see that we've got this story.
I am singing.
Okay. So I think that gives you a good sense of what some of the features are. We also have a download feature. And what you can do with this download feature is print out very easily these stories. Of course, children can also elaborate on these stories, develop their own stories around these pictures, which could also be very exciting in the classroom. So I think that that's probably enough, everybody. I think what I'm going to do, what I'll do is briefly just take you to our Storybooks Canada site, because what we've done in our Storybooks Canada site is we've tried to work very actively with teachers. And what we've seen is how important it is to link the stories to the curriculum. So what we've got, for example, is that we've aligned the stories, the 40 stories that we have, with the BC curriculum, and we've showed how the stories link with social studies and physical and health education and language arts. And also what's very important is the high-low stories, because very often people who are learning a new language don't want to read children's stories. And so what we've identified in our set of 40 are stories that are appropriate for older children, 6 to 14 years old, for example. So these have got high interest and low vocabulary for middle school children as well. And so what we found is that, in fact, adults enjoy these as well. And Espen Stranger Johansson was just telling us, Liam and I, that he'd run a workshop for Norwegian people in Norway, adult immigrants in Norway, who were learning Norwegian, and they loved the stories. So they seem to work for a wide range of ages as well. I'll just take you to the Norwegian site because I know you're in Scandinavia and you talk to one another. So I'll just take you to the Storybooks Norway site as well. So you see, it's very easy to toggle between sites, and very, very easy to use. So I think that gives you a good sense, everybody.